I've been doing some work in my office to fix it up and make it more comfortable to use. And part of that is to build a false wall. And the false wall does a few things. Mainly it hides the wires from the monitors and speakers that I have. And it will be open on both sides. And behind there will be LED strips that will light the room. And I thought of several different ways that I could do this, but I eventually settled on what's known as Shiplap wall paneling. This stuff is typically made from solid wood, so I went to my home center to have a look and wasn't impressed with what I found, actually. It was pine and it was twisted and warped and full of knots, so I knew I would have more work to try to deal with that than to go with something like in a sheet form. Now, there is another option. They make this stuff also from MDF, but what the MDF doesn't have is wood grain, and I really wanted to have a little bit of that. So the plywood that I'm using for this is sanded pine, and before I can route the slots, I need to make a simple jig that will work with my router. And there's not a whole lot to this. It's just a piece of 1/4-inch hardboard with a hardwood strip along one edge that's the same size as the slot that I'll cut. I'm drilling a 5/8 inch hole, spaced 5 3/4 of an inch away from that strip, and that's for a guy bushing in the base of my router. I have a 1/2 inch straight cutting bit in the router, and I'm going to cut these slots in 2 passes. The wall that I'm building is not a full 8 feet long, so I need to trim off the end of this sheet. And to do that, I'm using my straight edge guide and making the cut with a handheld circular saw. This guide is perfect for this kind of thing, and if you'd like to build one, I have easy to follow plans available, and there's a link in the description. With the panel cut to length, I can start routing the slots, and the first one is with the hardwood strip on the jig up against the edge of the plywood. After I make the first pass, I'll adjust the depth of cut on the router and make a second one. And here you can see how the jig works. The hardwood strip fits in the slot that I just cut, and it will space the next slot over by the same amount. And the exposure is 5.5 inches plus a 1/2 inch for the slot equals 6. And that works out perfectly for a 48 inch wide panel. After I finish cutting all the slots, I use my block plane to slightly chamfer the edge on each slot. And I also use the plane to back bevel what will be the top edge of the sheet. This gives me a tighter fit for the second sheet that'll sit on top. Because the false wall will be open on the ends, I need to sand that as well and slightly round it over. I also sanded the entire surface lightly with my random orbit sander, just to make sure that it's absolutely smooth and ready for paint. And speaking of paint, I did the whole thing with a brush, even though it would be faster to use a roller. Using a brush will accentuate the wood grain, whereas a roller adds texture and will tend to hide it. After the first coat dried fully, I sanded it lightly and put on the second coat. I want to get 2 complete coats on and dry before I install this, and then I'll put on a third coat after they're in place. And that last coat of paint will cover any nail holes or damage from installing it. Anyway, that's it. I think it turned out pretty good. And if you're interested in more detail, including the floating shelf that I built here, you'll find that in the build article. There's a link in the description.